Welcome, class, to our Week 8 presentation. This week we are continuing our discussion of poetry. We're going to go over some different terms that I did not go over last week. And I apologize for this being a little bit late coming to you, but I was really excited about this topic and I had a little extra research to do before I could actually put this out there to you. So let's go ahead and get started. So this week what we're going to look at are some different poetry terms, and then we're going to start to look at analysis of poetry through an example poem that I have. And it is not one of the poems that we're looking at this week, but I think that it's applicable in terms of the way that it's presented. So let's go ahead and get started. Poetry has a lot of detail kind of elements that people get hung up on. So I just wanted to go through some different terms and make sure that you understand what these things mean, and so you can apply these terms to your descriptions of different poems. So poems are unlike prose, which are the short stories that we've been reading are in the prose form, because they have structure that is beyond what we would see in an essay or short story format. So they have a specific type of structure. Now, poems come in many different shapes and forms, and I wanted to just kind of talk about what these things are called so that if you see them mentioned, you know what's going on. So the first thing would be a line. So instead of talking in sentences for poems, we look at lines. And a line is a single line of text in a poem. So this could be anywhere in a poem, but it's just the line of text that is on the same plane of field in terms of the poem. So you might have 5 sentences in a poem, but you have 22 lines. It really just depends on how they're broken up on the page. Now, oftentimes when you approach a poem, they will have what are called stanzas, and this is a group of lines added together. And a lot of times when you have stanzas, they have a particular format in a poem. So it could be a 4-line stanza pattern, and so there's several 4-line stanzas throughout the poem, and each of those stanzas have their own little words for them. So a 2-line stanza, a group of lines, would be called a couplet. A 3-line stanza is a triplet, then a quatrain, a quinrain, a sestet, and an octet. So those are the names for different types of stanzas, and it's really just a group. A lot of times students will call these paragraphs. They're not paragraphs. They're not written in paragraph form, but it's a group of lines of text added together into a pattern of sorts. And poems could have any number of stanzas depending on the type of poem and just the poem itself, and they don't always have to go where they are only couplets or they're only triplets. They could have a mix, and some poems don't have them at all. So basically it's a break. So you'll have a group of lines together and then a space and then another group of lines is generally how a stanza works. Another thing that you might see is something called rhyme scheme, and this is a pattern of rhymes in a poem. So rhymes, of course, are words that end in similar sounds, and a rhyme scheme would be to see if a poem has a particular pattern of the ends of lines, so the ends of lines that rhyme. And these are often presented through or represented by letters. So if a poem has a line that ends in rain, and then the next line ends in Spain, and the next line ends in dog, and the last line of the stanza ends in fog, so you notice the first 2 lines rhyme and the second 2 lines rhyme, so of the stanza. And so the rhyming pattern is A, B, B. So A and A rhyme together and B rhyme together, and that's a type of rhyme scheme or pattern of rhymes, and that can be anywhere all over the place. I mean, you could have an AB pattern, you can have an ABCA pattern. I mean, it really just, it's up to the writer. And different kinds of formats of poems will have specific patterns or rhyme schemes in mind. And of course, all of these are kind of up to the writer's interpretation if they decide to break with the rhyme scheme. A lot of times you'll see words that look like they would rhyme in terms of how they are spelled, but they don't end up rhyming. It's more for the look of it. So it just depends on the author and their point of view and what they want to do with the rhyme. Rhyme has a lot to do with rhythm. And as we discussed last week, poems often are very lyrical in nature. They have more of a musical quality, and rhythm and rhyme relate directly to that musical quality. Another type of literary element that you'll see in poems are alliteration, and this is a repetition of the initial consonant sound. So rhyming is the repetition of an end sound to a word, and this is an initial consonant sound at the beginning. So a very extreme example of alliteration would be a tongue twister. Sally Snail saw the same as squirrel sing 7 silly songs. Okay, so every word in that sentence has an S sound. So a repetition of initial consonant sounds is called alliteration. A couple other things. So consonance is the repetition of intermediate or final consonant sounds. So we have rhyming that has kind of the whole sound of the word that sounds the same. Fog, dog, rain, Spain. Okay, so consonance has to do with the end sound of a word. So that could be flit, and it could be float, or both of those have the beginning sounds that are the same at the end with the T sound at the end. It could be Connecticut, flit, float, and carrot. Okay, so they don't have any rhyming going on. There's not a lot of alliteration going on, but the end of the words all have that T sound, and that would be consonants. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds. So whether that's in the middle of a word or at the beginning of a word, but it really has to do with the vowels. And so this is where you're going into things that maybe words that are several together that have an oo sound in the middle of the word. And it creates a different kind of lyric sound to it. So assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds. Rhythm, like I mentioned, is a pattern of beats or a series of stresses and unstressed syllables in a poem. And it does create a rhythm, just like a song. And we're going to talk about that in the next slide, some different examples of rhythm patterns in poems. Mood has to do with the feeling that a poem creates in the reader. And I think that's an important part to look at because we're talking about tone this week. And tone is the attitude of a writer and how the writer's attitude is expressed about the subject of the poem or the audience of the poem, how the writer expresses a particular attitude. And mood is the feeling that a poem creates in you, in the reader. So those are the differences there. Imagery, we see in sensory writing, this is the language that appeals to the 5 senses. So sound details, sight details, all that kind of stuff. Things that make you imagine the scenario, so imagery. And meter is a measure of a line of poetry. So it has to do with the patterns that are created through rhythm. Whoops. So let's talk about meter and rhythm in particular. So this is how the meter and the rhythm happen through syllables, through pauses. So when we see the end of a line, when we see punctuation, when we see the end of a stanza, we get these elements of rhythm. And then meter has more to do with the individual syllables themselves. But a group of 2 or more syllables that are creating a pattern are called a foot. I don't really know why. It just is. And there are several different types of foot patterns or meters in poetry. Now I'm going to tell you about these things and we'll look at them a little bit, but I'm going to tell you also that a lot of what we're reading is more modern poetry, and so they may or may not have these more stringent kind of rules to them, because the modern poetry tends to be a little more free form, But this is something especially that you'll probably see if you read Shakespeare in school. Shakespeare is the king of meter, and you'll see that in more traditional classic literature. But we'll go over it. So an iambic foot or an iambic pattern is where an unaccented syllable is followed by an accented syllable. So examples of that, because. So notice in that saying that word, because, the first syllable of the word is unaccented, and the second syllable is accented, because. So if you had a poem line that had an iambic meter, you would have lots of words that have, or words or groups of syllables that have a kind of a bouncy kind of sound. Because, hello, Elaine. So you would have kind of that kind of jumpy rhythm. And if you had several of those in a row. So keep in mind that because is its own foot. It's a group of two syllables together, and it's an iambic foot because it has the first syllable as unaccented and the second syllable is accented. So the same thing with hello, Elaine. So all of those are iambic feet per se. Trochaic is an accented syllable followed by an unaccented syllable. So it's the opposite. Tuesday, Albert, answer. So notice the first syllable is accented. Tuesday, Albert, answer. It's a little slower sounding to me than an iambic meter. And then you get into like iambic pentameter. And that would mean that it's iambic, so it has that unstressed, stressed, and pentameter means that there are 5 groups or 5 feet in the line. 5 feet in the line, iambic style. So iambic would be unaccented, accented. And if it's iambic pentameter, that means that there's 5 sets of feet in the rhythm that are iambic. Okay, so you'll hear those kinds of things, especially when you look at more classic literature. Dactylic is an accented syllable followed by 2 unaccented syllables. So then when you start getting feet that are 3 syllables long, beautiful, silently, Saturday. So notice the way that the words come out creates a rhythm. So beautiful, silently, Saturday. Well, another thing to keep in mind with any of these is that they don't have to just be one word. So if it could be several words put strung together, or 2 or 3 words strung together to create these patterns. So it doesn't just have to be one word. I just have examples that are one word. But that's accented by 2 unaccented. Anapestic is 2 unaccented followed by an accented. Tambourine, Marianne. So we can put those together to create a rhythm. And then there is spondaic, which is 2 accented syllables, and pyrrhic, which is 2 unaccented syllables. So they're just different groups of syllables put together. And then when you start stringing everything together, you get a rhythm. And you'll see that in poetry where, especially, please do read these things out loud, because it does create that element of understanding how the lyric goes, how the music goes with the poem. So if you read it out loud, you'll start to, and slow it down, you'll start to see those rhythmic patterns. And now you know the names of them. So what I wanted to do next is, I wanted to look at a poem and do some analysis of it, because that's what ultimately we're doing in class, right? We're reading poems and we're analyzing them based on different questions and ideas about poetry. So I have a poem, and this is actually a poem by, I had a poetry professor as an undergrad, and this is a poem by that professor, and Marcus Cafagna. And it was really cool because several years ago I sent him an email and asking him if I could use his poem in my class, and he said yes, of course. But he also gave some insight into the poem that I could share. So I have that shared info, but we're going to wait till later to look at it. But this poem is called Geography, and I think that it's really applicable to what we're doing because several of the poems that we're reading this week are poems that have that tagline that shows that the poem was written for or to someone. And I think that having an idea of who is the poem is connected to gives us a different perspective. So it's not just a poem that the writer is writing for reflection or to share some big idea. The writer is writing specifically to a certain audience. And we'll see that in several of the poems we're looking at this week. And this particular poem is also one of those elements. So it's called Geography for Morton Marcus. So I'll go ahead and read it. This is the geography of a man who believes in the sadness of place names, unadorned by adjective or verb, who each morning spreads maps and railroad timetables over furniture gone wobbly in 29, when he lost his fortune of railroad bonds, a nobility displaced in his voice, always this anger bending to sadness, this cello sound deep and sonorous as a concerto, a man who always wore a tie and detachable collar, 250 pounds, and kept a bar of soap in his shirt drawer, who smelled sharp and fresh during a time of no air conditioning or deodorant, who worked for Wurlitzer Oregon collecting late time payments at $10 a week, who spent his depression pulling electrical wire at Brooklyn Navy Yard, an Orthodox Jew who ended up selling pork lard for Armour Meats, who never touched money on the Sabbath in front of Gentiles, who loved Gene Autry westerns, black and white matinees at the King's Theater on Flatbush Avenue, who in 1930 left New York for a day to marry a woman in a Reformed synagogue in Knoxville, Tennessee, who labored in the dim out dark of 1943, a block warden looking in neighbors' windows for cracks of light, for blackout curtains with the rapid impression of his flashlight, who still rides the Brighton Beach L block after combustible block, his sisters back on cattle cars to the cams who open his eyes on the passengers who vanish. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at this poem. I think it's really super powerful. And one of the things that I think it's important when we look at poems, especially, we're reading poems that were written several decades before we were born. And we've talked a lot about how understanding the times helps us understand the work and so on and so forth, as far as like it helps us understand the work, but the work helps us understand the time. So it's that dichotomy that we're really looking closely at. But when we look at this poem, there are several elements that relate directly to the time in which our protagonist, and we're going to assume is Morton Marcus, because that's who it's for, but whoever the geography of a man is describing. We're looking at a time frame that there's a lot of details from the time that we need to know what those things mean to have a greater understanding of the work. So I wanted to define some elements within the work to help us understand the historical context. So the first thing I wanted to do is just define some vocabulary. So the first one is sonorous, and this means a loud, deep, or resonant sound. And this was associated with that line. I really enjoy this line. It says, always this anger bending to sadness, this cello sound deep and sonorous as a concerto. And I really just love that line and that imagery. It may be because I have a music background, I don't know, but I just think the idea of how your voice can encompass anger and sadness at the same time so connects with the cello. And the cello is this instrument that it's not a big upright bass. It's more melodic than an upright bass. Upright bass is just dong, dong, dong. It's keeping the down beat kind of thing. But a cello it's like the human voice. So you have this deep sound, this deep music that comes from a cello, and it can be angry, just loud and deep, like thinking of a man yelling. But then you could also get this bend in the cello and the slow down and the dynamics that make it sad. And it's just a really cool instrument, and so to have that connection is really exciting. So the sonorous gives you an impression of what his voice sounded like, but it also relates to that cello sound. And a concerto is, I think this is also interesting, is we look deeply into a poem, even through the definition. So a concerto means a composition for one or more principal instruments with an orchestra accompaniment. So this is kind of cool, because a concerto is where you have one instrument or maybe a couple instruments at the front, and they are the star of the show. They're the ones that are leading everything. And then you have the orchestra behind it. So it's not a solo where it's the only instrument on the stage. It's not a solo performance, but it is a performance that is centered around the solitary instrument, where everything else is there to back it up. And I think that is so awesome when we look at this poem, because the poem is about the geography of a man and how all these different elements from the historical context, from his life, kind of compile to give us a picture of who that man was. And I just think this is so awesome, because a concerto, that's what they do. It's all these instruments that are backing up that single solitary instrument at the front. So it's a cool thing to think about. So anyway, so when we look at these individualized details in the poems, we really get a picture of what the author intends and what the mood and the attitude is. So then let's look at some definitions of kind of some more technical things about the historical context. So this is just really, we want to look at this because we want to know what these things are. I mean, if you read something and you don't know, it doesn't give you as much of an understanding. So I have here detachable collars. The poem says that the man always wore a tie and a detachable collar. And this is when men's shirts were collarless, and they would have these really starched collars, which we have here on the left, that they would put around their neck and then have the tie on top of that. It always makes me think of the Peter Pan movie and how the father is trying to get dressed at the beginning and he's putting on his cufflinks and that kind of stuff. Well, part of it had kind of the play on his detachable collar and the cummerbund and that kind of stuff, and the kids make a map out of it and that. So it's kind of like, that's what it reminds me of, but these really high starched collars, and you have a formality that's related to these starched collars. So you can see that the man takes pride in the way he looks. So, and you see that several times throughout the poem. So it's not only that he takes pride in his detachable collar and tie, but you see that he puts soap in his drawer so he smells fresh. His clothes smell good when he puts them on, and it's a really interesting detail. So that's something about his character, that he wants to appear and feel fresh and put together. It says that he worked for Wurlitzer Organ and to collect late payments. So this is for people that bought an organ or a piano on credit. So here's an ad from, I think it's from the 1950s, but it just kind of gives you an idea of what Wurlitzer sells. So they sell pianos and organs, and this is later, so they also sell stereos. But thinking about that Depression era element, so he went around door to door collecting late payments. And this is for people that they bought it before the crash and now they have no money. And so he's for a dime a week. So this is really like an intensive kind of thing. I'm only getting a dime a week to come and try to take money from you. So it's like a desperation, but he's willing to do the work. Another element that's discussed, and this is another job kind of related deal. It said that he worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard pulling electrical line during the Depression, and I like the way that I'm going to go back to the poem, the way that is portrayed, because it's kind of a cool way to word it. It says here, who spent his depression pulling electrical wire at Brooklyn Navy Yard. And that kind of gives just this personalized element to it. So it may not necessarily be a direct reference to the Great Depression. I think it probably is, but it also can be there can be a dual meaning there, where we see, was he actually depressed during that time, mentally, emotionally? And then you have the actual Great Depression. So he's putting that his depression instead of his time during the Depression or his Depression era or his Great Depression, that there's this connection that it's very personal. So I think that that's an important element of the poem. But here we have just some information about the Brooklyn Navy Yard. I found it very interesting. I found some research on the Brooklyn Navy Yard and how they handled things during the Great Depression. So the Brooklyn Navy Yard worked to build ships and submarines and the infrastructure needed for those vessels in the sea and on the ground. So we think Navy Yard and we think huge ships, and that's all they worked on, but think they're also submarines, but they also did the infrastructure. So you have the boards and like the electrical element in a ship, but also how do you communicate with that ship once they are out to sea, so that home-based stuff as well. And they also employed civilians and Navy officers to do the work. The production of ships and other vessels really depreciated during the Depression. They were I think that what I saw were like maybe 3 ships over like 6 years, and I guess that was a really low number. So the amount of work available was rather small in comparison to the rest of the time. But the workers were rather lucky because the way that the military works on their, at least at that time, how they divvied out their pay scales is they addressed it every 10 years. So they had already passed the 1930 pay scale element for the 30s before the Depression started, which started in 1929. So they already passed all the legislation that had to do with pay scale. And so if you had a job there and they kept you on, you had a paycheck and it was consistent. Though low, but I thought that was interesting. That so if he spent time during the Great Depression working for the Brooklyn Navy Yard, he actually had a steady job. So that's an even if it's low pay, that's one of those things that they were lucky that they actually had a job that was already set in stone, kind of thing. Now they weren't getting raises, but they actually did get paid. So one source stated, quote, one Navy file memo noted that in 1932 the average hourly wage of per diems in the Navy Yard was 24.95 cents per hour, or 44.5% higher for the same ratings in private plants in their vicinity. So in the same area, people that worked for the Brooklyn Navy Yard were making 44% higher pay than other private sector jobs. So this angered non-unionized commercial shipbuilders in search of work, but it's just one of those things, I guess. So other things that mentioned was he worked for Armored Meats with pork lard, which was kind of ironic because he's a Jew, and Jews disdain pork. They don't eat pork, and so having to handle it, it's almost like, if you look at in biblical terms, there's the story of the prodigal son, and the prodigal son, leaves his father and goes off and tries to do things on his own, and he parties it up and he kind of spends everything, and then by the end of the story he ends up working with pigs, and he is jealous of the pigs because they have something to eat. So and that story kind of gets a little bit more deep, and this is similar kind of juxtaposition, because it's a Jew having to work with pigs who see pigs as unclean animals that they wouldn't eat, they wouldn't touch. And so to have the story in the Bible with the prodigal son brings it to a new level of how low he went. And this is a similar idea of he is willing to work. And I think we see that over and over in the poem. This man is willing to work, and he, in order to make it through, he'll do whatever it takes. He's gonna take up late payments. He's going to keep his job with the Navy Yard. He's going to work with pork lot. Whatever he can do to continue to support himself and his family is going to do. And Armor Meats is just a meat packaging company that works with prepackaged meat. Think things like bologna and canned ham, that kind of stuff. But they also do frozen stuff now. So this is actually their website. They're still a company, and you can go on and order food from Armor Meats, or you can go to the grocery store and find food from Armor Meats. So it's still there. Another thing that was mentioned is that he enjoyed Gene Autry westerns, and that was just a relation to a particular actor that was a genre actor, and all the movies that he did were basically westerns. And these are just some different movie titles. He did Back in the Saddle, and Loaded Pistols, and Robin Hood of Texas. There's lots and lots of films. You could go on Google and it would just be film after film after film. So we enjoyed those types of movies. Another element that was mentioned was the King's Theater on Flatbush Avenue. And this is a theater that was, the coolest thing to grace New York for a long time. I do suggest you go to their website. They're still in production. And the Brooklyn Flatbush King's Theater, so just Google it. And it's cool because, and we're not going to go there now, but they've restored this theater to its previous glory. So this is a picture of the restored version, and it went into disrepair for several decades after the 1930s. They became a movie theater, and then it just was neglected a lot. So they've restored it, and it's become an actual live theater again. But it's just opulent. All the details, really interesting. So this person, you think about this, so he liked to present himself in a professional way. He tried to keep himself fresh. He worked really hard, and he enjoyed the opulence of King's Theater. Okay, so that gives us kind of a picture of who this guy is. And then we have another element which I found really interesting was the 1943 blackouts. It says that he worked as a warden during the 1943 blackouts. So this is World War II era, and these were government sanctioned times of putting the city into complete darkness. So they were drills in case of bombings. So they were saying, okay, we're going to do this at night. We're going to black out the buildings. So a plane going overhead that had intended to bomb New York wouldn't be able to see it as easily because all the lights are out. So it would kind of, black out the city and keep people relatively safe from bombings. And that was the purpose of it. And so they would do these drills throughout 1943 and other years throughout the war. They would have sirens that would notify people that, okay, this siren so many times says, okay, everybody go home. And when this siren sounds so many times, you have to cut out all your lights, and we'll have a time of blackout. And the wardens would walk around the streets and check people's windows and make sure they're blacked out, and to ensure compliance. And then, but after these things have been checked, they would sound another alarm, and everybody could turn their lights back on. And this man that is being described in the poem is a blackout warden. So he's walking the streets, flashing his flashlight into the windows to make sure that they're blacked out completely. And people would put curtains in front of their windows, black curtains, so that absolutely no light could get through. So maybe they turn off all their electricity, but they have candles going in the house. Well, as long as the curtains are completely covering the window, they shouldn't be able to see the candles. But so that's the idea. But he was a warden checking that. And so now we know kind of this picture of this man who's trying to keep it all together. He's working hard to keep it all together through a really difficult time. And then we have a bit of an element that sees into who he is and what he's willing to do. And it mentions in the poem that he's an Orthodox Jew and that he marries a woman from a Reformed synagogue. So it's important to really kind of know what those things are. So an Orthodox Jew are very strict Jewish people that believe in the Torahs, that follow the letter of the law kind of thing, in the concepts of Messiah, a Savior that is yet to come. Reformed Judaism reveres the writings of the sages, of the Torahs, but does not believe in the divinity of them or other texts, and does not believe them to be infallible. So we have a very conservative group of Jewish people, and then a very more liberal church. And men and women are not segregated in the Reformed Church when it comes to worship, but they are in the Orthodox Church. The belief is based that women are impure during menstruation, so Orthodox Jews believe that women would also be a distraction to the men, so they keep them separate. This is not the case in the Reformed Church. Orthodox Judaism does not allow women to become rabbis, but the Reformed Church does. Orthodox Judaism is conservative and strict in its approach, and the Reformed Judaism is progressive and liberal in its approach. So that's the difference. So he is an Orthodox Jew, and this is a guy that has starched collars. He's trying to keep himself together. He's worked really hard to make sure that he can still provide a living for himself. And in the middle of it all, he goes and marries a woman from a Reformed church. And so there's also this element of he's willing to change and willing to mold to the times and to life in general, and let those things kind of encompass him and change him a bit. So when we look at all those things, I think it gives us a really cool, well-rounded approach to the poem. So understanding those elements can give us some depth to the poem itself. And then we can look at other things like the tone of the poem, look at the theme. So what is the tone? The tone seems almost reverent to me. And the theme does have a little bit of that juxtaposition between holding it all together and then what's really going on deep inside. Because yes, we have that element of the Orthodox versus the Reform Judaism, but then we have the end of the poem. And here this is this guy who's trying to hold it together. He's trying to hold it together. He keeps his shirt starched. He works really hard. You know, he's making sure that he keeps a job the entire time. He's even being a warden for blackouts. You know, he's doing all the things that he can. And this is during a time that anti-Semitism was very rampant. You know, refugees were not allowed in the country during World War II. So even though the United States did liberate the camps that the Nazis had, there was still a lot of anti-Semitism going on in the country at the time. And here, so he's working hard. He's trying to do his job. He's trying to get things done. He's letting things, but he does let some things in. We see his wife, and we see that he enjoys the King's Theater, and so he still has these personal elements. And then at the end, says he writes the Brighton Beach L, block after combustible block. So we see him on the subway. You know, he's going through the subway. You see him riding the subway. You can imagine it. And when you go in a subway, it's like you see lights go by, and it's almost strobe-ish, you know, and it's like the train car's moving, and everything's flying past really fast. Okay, so it's a train. And he rides the subway train, block after combustible block, and the last lines, his sister's back on cattle cars, who open his eyes on the passengers who vanish. So it's relating back to he was trying to hold it all together here in the United States in New York, trying to do what he can, and then what's really going on is that his sisters are in Europe in cattle cars. And it's really super powerful. And so we see that connection to who he is and that almost reverent kind of tone and a theme of, how do you hold it together through such strife? And what does the outside project when really what's going on in the inside? So that outer man versus the inner man kind of theme. So thinking about who is this person in the poem, and how does that person relate to theme? How does that person relate to tone? When you're analyzing, looking for literary elements like similes and metaphors, the whole idea about the concerto element is a great simile about his voice. So there's other elements you could take a look. And then also the dramatic irony of it all. So here we have the irony is that he's trying to hold it all together when what's really going on inside is he's thinking about his sisters. So that's what's really going on. And that's that dramatic irony. It was building and building and building, and that's what it ended with. So other things to look at: how does the historical context shape the poem, which we've kind of discussed throughout this presentation, and then what is your reaction? Because ultimately, I love it. I think it's awesome to delve into this kind of stuff, but your reaction is your reaction. It's your interpretation of the poem, and it has resonance. It sets the mood for you. That's your personal mood that you come off of with the poem. So when we're looking at poetry, we look at all of these elements, and it really gives us deep insight into what's going on and what was the writer thinking and what was the writer trying to portray. And I just think it's a really cool way to approach writing. And see, we have this poem that's not really long. It maybe a page or two of lines, and that's it. And yet we still get all of this depth. I love it. I think that's an awesome thing about poetry, that you could say so little but actually be saying so much. So like I mentioned at the beginning, I emailed my old instructor and just asked about the poem and could I use this poem in my class and that kind of stuff. So he actually wrote me back and gave me some answers, so I thought it would be good to share some excerpts from the email he sent back. So he said, "Misty, I really do appreciate your message. The fact that you use my poem as an example to your students, I'm flattered. I would be happy to answer any questions you have about the poem Geography from my first book. It was written in honor of a man named Saul Marcus, my stepfather's father. Though I never met the man, I heard some great stories about him, and the fact that he lived the way he did at the time he did seems to me a tribute in itself. Of course, on a personal and cultural historical level, he lived through World War II stateside as a Jew during a time when anti-Semitism was rampant, even through the United States. Even though the United States was fighting the Nazis and would eventually, along with the British, liberate the concentration camps in Poland and Germany. More than anything else, I think the poem speaks to his endurance and love of family, and of course, the railroad, even though his family had lost their wealth years before the outbreak of war. His story is the story of many Jewish families and their patriarchs who suffered economic, social, and historical woes. I want to bestow a measure of mercy upon the characters of my poems. I write to honor and preserve the memory of many people in my family or about others I have come to know or hear about. I believe that poetry needs the presence of the ordinary people among us who persevere through such extraordinary circumstances. This is especially true of much of our immigrant population. Though Saul's family came to America years before World War II, his sister-in-law and my Aunt Sarah, who I also write about in my first book, was an immigrant who came to America after World War II. I hope my response has been helpful, and thanks again for your continued interest in my work." So it was kind of cool just to get that extra feedback from him and understand the poem even more and what his intention was as a tribute. And it was really a cool way to get to know the poem more. So that's all I have for this week. If you do have any questions or concerns, obviously, you're welcome to email me or shoot the questions off in the discussion board. I hope that this gave you a little bit of insight on how to approach a poem and what approaching a poem with that amount of intensity can get for you. So thank you so much and have a great week. Bye.